Thank you again, everyone, for joining on a Saturday morning for our monthly wellness dialogue. My name is Anu Rajiv, and I will be your host for today's session. Welcome to Samachita Foundation's Wellness Dialogue session, and today's is on the power of words, talking about suicide responsibly. Every month, as some of you may know, we bring topics related to mental wellness. We've had empathy, we've had listening, we've had overcoming grief, addiction, suicide. Um, the objective is not really only to raise awareness, but also to be able to really use it in your lives, either for yourself or for your near and dear one. Um, and before we jump into the session, I would like to take a few minutes to talk about Samachita Foundation and Pokar. Samachita Foundation is essentially building primary emotional well-being structure in India. Pokar Helpline is an initiative of Samachita Foundation, which is an emotional support helpline, um, totally run by volunteers. It offers free, non-judgmental, confidential, anonymous emotional support to anyone feeling stressed, depressed, or suicidal. And I'm sure we've all had times when we needed someone just to listen to how we are feeling. So we will be sharing the details of the helpline on chat, and feel free to share it with anybody you think might benefit from this. We operate every day from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And as I mentioned, please do share the message. Arun will be sharing it on chat shortly. Before I introduce Vikas, who's our speaker for the day, I want to just get some housekeeping rules and introduce the topic briefly. We will be recording the session, and if you missed it, you'll find it on our YouTube channel. We want it to be interactive, but if you don't mind, maybe towards the first half when Vikas is talking about it, if you can put any questions that really pop up in chat, we will definitely address it. And towards the end, of course, we will have a Q&A as we always do. Towards the end, we will also have a very, very short feedback form that it would be amazing if you could fill. It really helps us to know if this worked, what other topics you might like to hear from us, and things like that. It's really short, and it would really be helpful. And yeah, I think with that we can jump right into the session. And this session I think is particularly close to my heart because very recently my daughter and I were talking about, I've been in this space for a while, and she was like, doesn't talking about this make it worse? Like everyone knows about suicide now, and doesn't talking about it make it worse? Um, and it took me by surprise as well because words are strange, they take only a few seconds to say. They stay with us for years. Most of us can remember sentences that hurt us deeply or had some impact on us. So words do have power in that sense. So imagine the power they have when, in fact, it's written in media or talked about by all of us these days, right? When someone, especially if someone is going through deep emotional pain, imagine the power that words can have, the good and the bad. So we will take a top-down approach today, I think, where we'll speak about how media reporting of suicide happens or should happen and the impact of that. And if you really think about it today, we are all some sort of media, right? We are all sharing news through WhatsApp, Twitter, LinkedIn, so many various platforms. So it would be interesting for us to also pay attention to these guidelines to see what are we doing to enable more hope in this space rather than otherwise, right? Whether we realize it or not, we are all part of this conversation. And when it is about suicide, the words we choose can really make a difference, as you will see when Vikas speaks about it. So it's not about being it's not about us being journalists or media reporters or anything, and only then this is relevant. It's irrelevant to each one of us in our life. It's about understanding how our words can reduce harm and, more importantly, offer hope, possibly. Right. So I'm so glad that Dr. Vikas Arya is with us today to speak about this. He's done so much work on this for the last decade or so. He's a research fellow at the Center for Mental Health and Community Wellbeing at the University of Melbourne. He joins us from Sydney today. His research primarily focuses on epidemiology. I'm sorry about the mispronunciation of that, of suicidal behavior and on media reporting of suicide. So I know that we have the right person here because his research did focus on this. He led the initial analysis on suicidal thoughts and behaviors from 2020 to 2022 in the Australian study of mental health and well-being. He's also been involved in evaluating New South Wales suicide monitoring system. Beyond Australia, he has also made a significant contribution to international suicide prevention. His research on suicide in India played a crucial role in shaping the country's first national suicide prevention strategy. That's pretty amazing, Vikas. I'm just in awe of all the work that you've done. And I think this is especially interesting to me. You also led Google and ISP initiative to develop a search engine coping module for users with suicidal ideation, creating pre-written crisis texts in Hindi and English, supporting millions of internet users in India. It's very much in line with kind of work we do, but I think more uh, tech focused. So I love that this is something you've worked on. And he has previously worked on as a research consultant for IASP and was the first to be hired to directly support IASP's central team for a low and middle income country. I know we are in right hands today. I really appreciate your time with us and for joining us from Sydney today. So let's get this started with maybe talking about the top down, like you were saying, maybe the media reporting, and I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Anu. Thank you so much for that introduction. And epidemiology is a word that took me, I think, 5 years to get right before I could.
You're so kind. Thank you.
I did a, I had to go through a whole PhD before I could pronounce it correctly. So it's not, trust me, it takes a while. That word is it's a
Thank you.
tongue twister, so don't worry about it. And thank you for highlighting whatever I've done. I've played a very small part in all of those things. So it's really embarrassing. It's not. It makes me sound like I've done so much. I haven't. I actually, there's so many more people who have done so much good work, and it's the people I've learned from that are possibly responsible for whatever little I've done. But thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me today. Before I begin, before I talk about media reporting and suicide, I'll just like to tell everybody said that I'll be tilting my face towards my left side because that's where my big screen is. So I'm not being facetious or I'm not being rude. I just my big screen is on that way, so I'll start looking that way. I hope that's okay.
That's
And with
perfectly
that,
fine.
I'll jump right into media and suicide. The role, so the role of media reporting and suicide, the role of how suicide is talked about in the media or fictional portrayal in novels or whatever, and its impact in the real world. This has been talked about for a long time. So it started in the 18th century. So the first known copycat suicides, which is what we call um, the copycat suicides, are the ones which happen after us, after, let's say, for example, a celebrity dies by suicide, and then there's a bunch of suicides that might be related to that celebrity suicide. That's what we call copycat suicides. Anyway, so the first real example comes from 18th century. So there was this really famous book called The Sorrows of young Werther, which was published in 1774, if I'm not mistaken. So that was from Wolfgang von Goethe. He was a very famous German writer. So in that book, Werther is this young man who's the protagonist of the story, and he finds himself in this love triangle in the book, and he believes that the only way out of that love triangle is to take his own life. So he, in that book, at the end of the book, he dies by suicide, and that book became really famous in Europe in the 18th century after it got released. The problem that happened after its release was many fans of the book, they could connect with Werther in some way. So Werther was this young guy, and many young people in Europe who read the book could connect with him, and some of them decided to take their lives. Many of them who took their lives after reading the book took it in the exact same manner as Werther did in the book. by a pistol. Um, so there was such a growing concern after the release of the book of increasing youth suicide in Europe that the author of the book Von Goethe, actually the second edition of the book, which was released in 1775, a year after the first was released, he actually put in bold letters on the front page, put, "Do not follow my example." It got that bad. Now, obviously, there was no studies back then on whether, even if there were, we don't know. So there were no studies that we know of that actually proved whether these suicides were a result of the release of the book. But if you look at, like, if we you know forward it back to like our times, there is extensive evidence that suggests that how a media reports a suicide can have a contagion effect, or copycat suicides, or imitative suicides, or Werther effect, as we call it, because it's based on Sorrows of Young Werther, the book I talked about. So they call it the Werther effect, which is basically copycat suicides, people who die by suicide after reading about it or watching it on news or reading about it in the newspapers, right? So it is known that these reports can especially have an impact. Newspaper reports can especially have an impact on copycat suicides if the reports are prominent, they are far-reaching, they provide explicit details about the method or the location of suicide, and they concern individuals with whom the audience identify. And because of that, when famous personalities die by suicide, that all of the research shows that confers the most risk is when famous celebrities die by suicide. That then people are most at risk of copycat suicides, and that's because of how those stories are covered by the media, first of all, because the media laps these stories up, right? Because they are their selling points. So if you see suicides on multiple, these famous people suicides mentioned on multiple newspapers on front pages, there's always these details around how they died by suicide. Many people would write it in the headline, or by hanging or something, and that attracts considerable interest, right? And the worst thing about this what happens with celebrities usually is people often think, especially in the social media age, when celebrities are constantly sharing their personal lives, you feel like you can identify with them. And the more you feel like you can identify with a famous person, the more you feel like you know them or you knew them. And that has an impact if that person goes on to die by suicide on the copycat effects. The other side of the coin is called the Papageno effect. So Werther effect is when the copycat suicides are called the Werther effect. The other side of the coin is the Papageno effect, which is actually based on. It's not based on. It's also so Sorrows of Young Werther, the Werther effect, that was also based on a fictional novel, and this one is also based. The Papageno effect is also based on a fictional play. So it was again 18th century. So there was this opera designed by Mozart. It was called The Magic Flute, and one of the main characters of that opera was Papageno. And what happens during the play is Papageno loses his love, and he feels like the only way out of this pain is to die by suicide. But before Papageno can act on those feelings of dying by suicide, three different characters show up, one after the other, and they show Papageno how to solve his problems. So by the end of the play, Papageno decides not to die by suicide. So it's like a happy ending, and the character Papageno, learns how to deal with your problems without, dying by suicide, or without taking the most, worst outcome, or without feeling so down negative about it, and everything. So that's called the Papageno effect. Now, there's less evidence out there of Papageno effect, as in the evidence which shows that if you put stories of hope, and you put stories of mastery of a crisis, if you put stories where people have mastered a crisis and come through the other end in a positive manner, there's less evidence of that having a impact on suicide, as in saving lives. But there's definitely more and more evidence now past 2 years has given us more evidence. Past 5 years, in fact, by till 2020, there was a lot of evidence for the Werther effect of how copycat suicide happened. But before 2020, there wasn't much evidence on if we put stories of hope and encouragement and strength, would that have an impact on saving lives? But now we are seeing more and more, and I'll talk about some of those evidences that it actually
Um,
has an impact. Yeah, sorry,
if I
Arya.
can interrupt you, sorry, Vikas.
Yeah,
So I'm just trying to put it together, right? I mean, I think what you're
yeah,
trying to say is when the articles are written in a sensational manner or with all of those
yeah,
things that you said,
yeah.
it it's very directly related to an increase in suicide. But when you write it in a more positive or a hopeful or the right manner in quotes, there's no direct as yet. There's no research that shows as yet that there is a reduction. Is that
So yeah, so there's two things here. What you're asking. So one is, if you responsibly report a suicide, a celebrity suicide, does that have an impact on reducing suicides? No, there's no evidence on that, but there is evidence of that having an impact on copycat suicide, as in copycat suicides will happen less or will not
yeah
happen if you report it um, responsibly.
responsible?
But
Got
the
it.
Papageno effect is more about the stories which give you hope, not about suicide, but how some person, say for example, a person was like Papageno, somebody was thinking of dying by suicide, but they didn't because they called the helpline, and that
Yeah,
helpline, like say for example, somebody called Pukar, and after calling Pukar, they decided not to die by suicide.
yeah.
So that's the Papageno effect. So if I put that
Yay.
story in the
Yeah,
newspapers, and if that leads to, and there's growing evidence now that that can lead to actually reducing suicides.
got
So
it.
that's the Papageno effect, where you put a story of hope prominently, and people read it, and people hopefully decide not to take the step of dying by suicide, but talk to somebody about it or do something else, seek out help. So that's the Papageno effect. Yeah.
Got it. Thank
Yeah, thank you. So for the Werther effect, which is the copycat suicides, WHO came up with a set of guidelines. These are these 10 guidelines, which basically, well, 10 was the first one. That was 2008 when the WHO came up with these responsible reporting of suicide in the media guidelines. So they range from, avoid simplistic reasoning,
you.
reporting simplistic reasoning for suicide, avoid using language that normalizes or romanticizes suicide. Don't advertise suicide on the front page. Do not put it on the front page. Definitely don't report the suicide method. Don't report the location, because that location becomes like a suicide hub sometimes. So do not report the location, and just do not publish photographs or anything. And special, be very careful when it's a celebrity suicide. You have to be really careful with celebrity suicides, because those are the ones linked with the most amount of copycat suicides. And respect the privacy of the bereaved. Do not go ahead and name the family members, or and provide information on helplines and useful resources at the end of the articles. So these are the sort of guidelines WHO recommended, and the Press Council of India actually, they adopted these guidelines officially in 2019. The problem with Press Council of India is it's largely a toothless organization. They don't actually have any jurisdiction over any newspaper, so they can't make anybody report anything responsibly. All they can do is they can tell people, can you please report it responsibly? But that's pretty much it. They can't do anything. And we did a paper where we looked at reporting of suicide in India before and after 2019, and we found that before, it's sort of similar. Still, it's pretty bad in India. It's very sensationalizing, but some newspapers like the Hindu have done really well. To give credit where it's due, some of the newspapers have done really well, and they have started reporting this really responsibly. More local newspapers, regional ones, they are the ones which we found had like the worst reporting. And some of like the Hindu, Indian Express, they had better reporting. Anyways, um, so in India, it's pretty poor. In many countries, it's actually poor, but especially in India and some of the other low and middle income countries, like if you look at Nepal, Bangladesh, all these kind of countries, suicide reporting is pretty bad. Um, but there haven't been much studies which have looked at the impact of these. Like one suicide that comes to my mind is always is Sushant Singh Rajput. and that happened on 14th of June 2020, I think. And we did a study where we looked at Google trends of search right after the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput, and we found that there was a lot of search around hanging and suicide, but we didn't have any data because we couldn't get monthly data, so we couldn't look at whether suicides actually increased following the death and reporting of Sushant Singh Rajput's suicide. So the examples I'll talk about mostly come from Western countries, and that's mostly because the evidence currently, good evidence, comes only from Western countries. And this evidence largely confirms what I've just talked about, how Werther effect leads to more suicides, and how Papageno effect can actually have an impact on lowering suicides. So the first one is Robin Williams. I don't know if most of you know about Robin Williams, but he was a very famous Hollywood actor and a comedian, a stand-up comedian. I think before rather than a Hollywood actor after. We certainly, I think, many of us have seen a lot of his movies. We're all really fond of him, and how funny he was and how witty he was. Anyway, so Robin Williams died by suicide in August of 2014, and it was a huge event, right? It was a huge event in the United States. And this is 2014, by the way, remember. So by then, responsible reporting of suicide is a big thing, especially in Western countries. Like everybody knows, every newspaper outlet knows that you have to responsibly report it. But after Robin Williams' death, they found an increase in suicide rates in the following month in the United States. And it's, as is always the case, the increase was almost exclusively with the method hanging, which is what Robin Williams used. That's the other thing to remember. Usually, when copycat suicide happened, the method is the same. Remember, I talked about Werther and how he died by suicide, and the young Europeans were taking lives through the same method. It still holds. It's usually people who identify with the person. So the age group is usually dependent on the age group of the celebrity. So if celebrity is young, it would probably be young people. If the celebrity is older, it'll probably be older people. So with Robin Williams, we saw the largest increase among middle-aged and elder people, which is what Robin Williams was, and among males, which is what your Robin Williams was, and the increase was almost exclusively in hanging, which is what Robin Williams used. And the problem with the reporting of Robin Williams' suicide was the narrative. The problem was that it was the stories were always portrayed around Robin Williams was someone who was overwhelmed by depression, and whose suicide was shocking and inevitable in many ways. That's how it was reported, rather than emphasizing that the suicide was preventable and the help is available. So they really sensationalized it, the US media, and that had many studies following his Robin Williams' death found that suicides increased. Many people who looked at the newspaper reports following his death found that, I think there was one study which found that 46% of the articles that they looked at, they actually provided a suicide method of Robin Williams' death, and 27% of them, I think, romanticized the whole thing, that it was inevitable and how it was almost poetic. And only a bunch of articles put the helpline numbers at the end of the article. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the reporting of Robin Williams' suicide was less than optimal, and that, according to many studies, that led to an increase in suicides among males aged between 30 to 60 after 1 month after Robin Williams' suicide. The other suicides which are also prominent was Kate Spade, who died by suicide on 5th of June 2018, and then Anthony Bourdain died 3 days after by suicide on 8th of June 2018. Kate Spade was a very famous entrepreneur. I think most of you might have heard of her bags, of her Kate Spade. That was her. She had been going through anxiety and depression issues for years. I think she had her own battles. And Anthony Bourdain, he had also talked about going through depression. He was a famous chef in America, who had his own TV show. I think many of us might have seen his TV show when he used to travel to other countries looking at their cuisine. Anthony Bourdain, and many studies looked at the reporting of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade's suicide, and whether the reporting was good or bad, or whether suicides increased or not. And many studies found that following their deaths in July of 2018 in the US, there was an increase in suicide. Um, I think more among females, because I think what happened was Kate Spade died before Anthony Bourdain, and for those 3 days, the way Kate Spade's suicide was reported, there was a lot of backlash from many people on how dismal this reporting was. So Anthony Bourdain's suicide was, for lack of a better word, it was less badly reported compared to Kate Spade's, because for the past 3 days, Kate Spade's was reported so badly, and media had got so much backlash before that. With Anthony Bourdain, they were a bit more cautious. Nonetheless, they found that male increased too, but like by 4%. Among females, increased by 9%, and that might also be because maybe Kate Spade was a more known person than Anthony Bourdain, because Kate Spade, as I said, because of the bags and the merchandise, I think Kate Spade was a much known celebrity than Anthony Bourdain was a bit more. People who liked food and those kind of travel shows might have known Anthony Bourdain more, but Kate Spade was, omnipresent, because, if you go to a store, you can see the Kate Spade bag, right? So you could identify more with Kate Spade. Again, with Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, it was, they both die by hanging, and hanging were the only method that saw an increase in suicides was hanging. No other method showed an increase. It was hanging. So again, you report the method, and that's exactly what happens. The copycat suicides go through that method. And Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, both of their deaths had proved again that, when a celebrity dies, how it gets reported has an impact on copycat suicides. Um, and I want to talk about one more, and this one is interesting. And I was talking to Anu about this before before we started this session. 13 reasons why. So when we look at all the research that has been done on media reporting and suicide, there is less evidence of suicides increasing after a portrayal of a fictional suicide on TV or in a movie. There's not much evidence that that actually leads to copycat suicides. The evidence mostly comes from when a real celebrity dies by suicide and how newspaper reported. Newspapers and celebrities, those are the two major evidences in favor of the Werther effect, that it exists. When it comes to suicides on TV, especially fictional suicides, there's not much evidence that that actually lead to copycat suicides if somebody on a TV show fictionally dies by suicide. But interesting case was Netflix's series 13 Reasons Why. So Netflix released this series called 13 Reasons Why in 2017, was it? I think it was it was 2017. So I'll give you a bit of background. So that series follows a teenage girl who dies by suicide, and she leaves behind 13 tapes explaining why she took her life. Hence, the series is named 13 Reasons Why. And the series generated widespread criticism as soon as it released, because first of all, the way, if you've seen the show, it's very graphic. That suicide scene, it is very graphically portrayed. The suicide itself in the series is romanticized, and it's almost suggested that suicide is an act of revenge, and it can be used as a career of change, like it can bring about a community change. um, and it really departed from the established media guidelines of how you portray a suicide, non-fictional to fictional suicides. There was already a lot of hoopla around why have you done this. Like as soon as the series released, after a day or two, many researchers were really astounded at how this show was shot and how it was, completely there for everybody to see. So many people actually sent a lot of requests to 13 to Netflix, but Netflix really pushed back hard because this series became a major hit. So then they didn't want to do anything to water it down. So they pushed it really hard to not say anything. So researchers were like, the least you can do is at the beginning of each episode, you can put a warning that this deals with this and this. And if you're going through anything, these are the helpline numbers. Do not, but Netflix wasn't ready to do any of that. That all changed after many people released a bunch of studies from different countries, from Canada, from America. I think one was from somewhere in Europe. And all of them showed how suicides increased among 10 to 17-year-olds, because remember, this is a, a teenage girl who dies by suicide. So again, the copycat suicide, it's the same age group. So they looked at monthly suicide rates in America, and they looked at 2017, a month after. So it released in March, I think, and in April they looked at. So sorry, they looked at, and they found that there was an increase, like a 30% increase in suicides among those aged between 10 to 17. Um, and they looked at other things like homicide rates did not increase, but suicide rates did. And this one was also a strong evidence of the Werther effect. So 13 reasons why, to me, remains a very interesting. It shows me two things. One, that the idea that non-fictional portrayal of suicide in the on TV has less of an impact. It's sort of, maybe it's not so true. The second is, it may not be true nowadays, because TV now. So you have to remember, what TV looked at in 2005 doesn't look like that at all in 2025. Now we have, Netflix, we have all these web shows. People can access them anytime I want. I don't need to sit in front of a TV on Sunday at 8 p.m. to watch a specific movie. I can watch it anytime I want. I can watch it at 1 a.m. in my room without, anybody else watching. So it's TV is different now. And I think with that comes social media is a big impact now, right? How people tweet. And there's a lot of research around social media too now. How people tweet. If you tweet like extremely negative things about suicide or whatever, there's also examples of that where they have found an increase in suicides compared to when there's a lot of helpful tweets going around. So the media landscape itself has changed, which has a lot of impact. Um, so those were some of the examples of the Werther effect. There are other examples too, but I'll just stick to them because I don't want to go over time. And now I'll talk a bit about the good ones, the Papageno effect, which I'm really excited to talk about, because that's the other part of the coin, right? If you report something badly, that has a negative impact. So if you report the good things, if you put stories of hope in the media, does that have an impact? Does that save lives? Well, there are two instances where we can say that yes, they have saved lives. One is very recent. I'm sure most of you must have heard of Bon Jovi. I know he's really old now, but I mean, he still rocks. By the way, God, I love him. Yeah, I mean, he was, when I was a kid. That's, he was a major influence. Anyways, string trying to be him with this long hair. You can see that. But but so Bon Jovi, you have to understand that Bon Jovi is also very famous, not just because of his songs, but also who he is. So his contributions to the society, his charity, his personal life, they've all been talked about in the media. He's very revered as a hero in the US media. And Bon Jovi in 2024, he was shooting a video for one of his songs in Tennessee, in the state of Tennessee in the US. And where they were shooting the song, he saw this woman who was hanging by the ledge. So him, Bon Jovi, and one of his production assistants, they went over to the woman. They talked to her, and they actually pulled her out of that ledge, and she didn't die by suicide. So that became a really prominent story, especially in Tennessee, in the media, where Bon Jovi actually saved a life. So there was this recent study done to look at whether that had an impact on reducing suicides in Tennessee and whole of United States. And what they found was that there was actually a 22% reduction in suicides in Tennessee in the following month when Bon Jovi did that. This was mostly among males, again, because maybe Bon Jovi males identify more with Bon Jovi than females. But this was a story of hope and intervention and recovery, right? And it was and Bon Jovi was involved in it. Remember how I said that a celebrity suicide can trigger copycat suicides? Well, this is the other side, where a famous celebrity actually stopped a suicide. And what we see here, it actually, not only Bon Jovi directly stopped somebody's suicide, he may have indirectly helped that 22% reduction in Tennessee among males too. It didn't really give in whole of United States that this positive impact didn't hold for the whole of country, but it did help for Tennessee, and I think that's because the local media really um, enjoyed covering that story, and they put a lot of effort in promoting that story. So that was one really, and that research, the paper the paper that found this was authored by one of my best friends, Sangsu, who works with me in the center as I work. So we did talk about this paper when he was doing it was a very complicated analysis that he was doing. So we did talk about the analysis, and it was great to see these results. And that's what I'm so this is a recent evidence. This is 20. The paper came out last month. So as I said, like recent evidence is now telling us that hope stories of hope is actually working. I'll talk about another example. This comes from 2017 of Papageno Effect. There's this rapper in the US called Logic, and Logic released a song called 1-800-273-8255, which was named after the US National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Yes. And the song that Logic wrote was about this person who's experiencing suicidal thoughts and who calls the lifeline. And that person ultimately decides to live, not to die by suicide. And that was the whole song. And that song became a major media event. I think it won a Grammy. I think it was in the MTV Music Video Awards and everything, right? And so researchers looked at, just after this song was released, researchers looked at whether the calls to lifelines increased, because that's the number he promoted, and whether suicides decreased. And on both counts, they found positive things. So they found that calls to lifeline increased that number to around 10% the following month, and they found that there were around 250 fewer suicides the following month as there would have been if the Logic rappers wasn't released. And this is another example of Papageno effect at work, where a famous rapper put out a song. Literally, the song's lyrics were 1-800. It was really awesome. I think it was really awesome. You know, your lyrics is actually the lifeline number, and it had a real world impact. Again, it saved lives. So the rapper Logic's music saved lives. So there's more and more evidence now that you put these stories of hope and recovery in the media prominently, and you'll see people. So the people who identify with Logic, especially the younger males, probably. Yeah, there's plenty of example of that too.
This is, I mean, I'm just in, I want to take a moment to check in with the room as well, how everyone's feeling, and feel free to put it in the chat, because it it's really eye-opening to see. I mean, especially with the examples you gave. Thank you so much, because I think they're so relatable, with the Bon Jovi and Robbie Williams and all of these popular people that we know. It, I don't know. I'm feeling really sad that media doesn't feel the need to be more responsible. Um, and I'm feeling also sad that we as people tend to get influenced because of purely a business decision on their part. Um, uh, and I'm also feeling sad that the resources are not as, or stories of hope or resources are not as popularly reported as the sensation is. I'm curious to see if anybody else is, feeling strongly about these examples, and how it almost feels like we have been taken through a narrative because of media and been influenced by it, and it feels really unfair to us and the many lives that have been lost because of it. um, yeah, I'm just deeply impacted by it. Thank you so much. I think this was super helpful. And I think today it's even, and firstly, if anybody feels like sharing on chat, please do that. I know this was must have been quite difficult for some of us to listen to. But and today this is even more relevant. Like I was saying earlier, if you really think about it, we are each one of us walking, talking media these days, right? So I think each one of these guidelines that you spoke about in terms of responsible reporting kind of applies to us daily, on a daily basis. If if not for just suicide, for everything, but specifically for suicide. And I'm curious if you have any inputs on how we could translate this into our daily life. One example I want to pick up from what you were saying is how it has become second nature for you to say die by suicide rather than committed suicide. That's a big change in just the language. That's the power of the word, right?
Yeah.
Nobody commits a suicide, they
Yeah.
die by suicide. And that just that change in language, I think, makes such a huge difference in terms of just the lens with which we look at the person who died by suicide and also the act of suicide itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
I think
any other kind of practically things that you have changed possibly in your life because of the research that you have done,
I think one thing I'll say is I think words matter. I think this is one of the things that maybe, and I'll just talk about myself. I won't assume on talking on about talking on anybody else's behalf. But me personally, I when I was growing up, I don't think I realized words matter that much.
yeah,
And I could be, I would be the first person to admit that maybe sometimes even I was callous with the way I talk to some of my friends. Maybe it can be as little as making some fun of somebody, and those words I didn't realize before that they matter. Words
yeah,
matter, they do carry a lot of weight. I think when I was growing up, where I was growing up, I wasn't, but in my defense, there weren't many examples in front of me. There was no social media back in the day. This is late 90s, early 2000s. There was no social media, and the only examples we had was around us, and we all
yeah,
behaved sort of the same way that you are allowed to call people things or names, which is funny to many people, including you, but they carry words. They hurt a lot to somebody else
yeah,
who's going to. You don't know what impact they'll have on the other person, right? So it's like an extension of that.
yeah,
Once I started doing research and I started realizing words do carry a lot of weight, obviously I changed my ways. And commit is something, yeah. So it's an absolute no-no. Whenever I'm writing a manuscript or reviewing any work, if I come across anybody who says commit, I'm like, nah, you can't. Like that's the first thing that goes out. So commit inherently means that somebody has done something where you're implicating somebody because it's used in criminal language. It should
yeah,
not be used in suicide language because you're stigmatizing it, and
yeah,
that means that you won't talk about it because you need to talk about these things. You need to talk about the taboo subjects are only taboo because you make them so. you know
yeah, absolutely.
Talking about that, there's so many people think that talking about suicide would, like, especially with kids, if you talk to them about suicide, they'll die by suicide. That is not true at all. So there's a lot of research out there which shows that if you talk to kids about suicide, like 15, 16-year-olds, there's no evidence that that makes them more likely to die by suicide at all. If anything, it makes them more likely to talk about their feelings
Talk about
to
it.
others
Yeah,
because you have normalized it. You have told them that if you're going through something in your mind, it is not, you're not forbidden to talk about it with anyone. You can talk
yeah,
to your friends, to your family, to your teachers, anybody, right? But for that,
right.
you have to have that sort of that exposure. You have to tell people that it's okay. You have to tell children it's okay. So many times we don't have these kind of um, lessons in school because many parents are worried that this would lead my child to die by suicide, but that's
Right.
not true at all. So
Yeah.
that's the
And
other
it's a
side.
tight rope we're walking on if you
Yeah.
really think about it, right? I mean, we have to talk about it.
Mm.
And this is what I started with because this was the conversation I was having with my daughter, who's also a teenager, by the way. Um, you know, just does talking about it make it worse,
Mm.
which is
Mm.
it very loosely the Werther effect, if
Yeah.
you see it very, very loosely and very wrongly so as well, I admit. But how you talk about it really matters.
I mean,
Um,
that's exactly it, Anu. So I'll give you an example about this, how you talk about this. So the internet. So the internet, we call the internet a double-edged sword when it comes to suicide prevention. Why? Is because of the fact that there are many websites, many web platforms which provide helpful resources,
yeah,
right? And there's evidence that people do engage with them even more than helplines sometimes, because in helplines, yes, they are anonymous, but you're still talking to somebody. On web pages you
yes,
can be completely anonymous and you can just write, right?
yeah,
The other side of the internet is that luckily there are only a few, but there are a few websites which actually encourage suicide.
yeah,
So if you go to the websites, they tell you to not seek help, and they tell you to how to die by suicide and all those things, right? They're very
Yeah.
horrible, horrible websites. They get more attraction,
Yeah.
unluckily, but they're very less in number. So
Right.
what governments of Australia, what the government of Germany have done is they have really regulated these websites. So those bad
Yeah.
websites are not, they're completely banned. And the good
Yeah.
websites, they are also very heavily regulated to make sure that somebody is not doing any harm, even if their intention is good. So
Yeah.
this is exactly goes back to what you were talking about. It is a tightrope. You need to talk about it, yes, but you need to talk about it responsibly.
Responsibly. And that's what we're here to learn, right? I mean,
Yeah,
to know first of all that yes, you need to talk about it, and that
yeah,
you need to talk about it well, and then how is the
yeah.
question. And the other thing that I'm taking away from what you're saying, and this is also the conclusion of the conversation between my daughter and I, with conjunction in conjunction with Dolly, in fact, that day, because I was so disturbed by this thought that talking about it is going to make it worse, and are we in the wrong space? But the point is really that we have to amplify at some point the hope and the positive and the right ways of, and the resources also for that matter, rather than amplifying the sensationalism
Yeah.
of the suicide. So having said that, there is a message from, in fact, a teenager on this in this session. She says, I feel like the casualness with which the media reports suicide also makes people talk about suicide very lightly, like
Yeah,
making jokes about it, which may affect someone who's actually going through it. And I thought that was an interesting point
absolutely.
of
Yeah,
view, right?
and that's
Um,
that's the example of irresponsible reporting of suicide, right? Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right. And so one of the things that we could do is, of course, watching our language, and one of those things is to say, to be committed to saying die by suicide and not committed suicide. So if all of you who are present here today, if that's one thing that you take away in terms of power of words today, that is one thing that I would definitely suggest. There is a framework that I came across, and I think it helps kind of put together everything that you've said. Because if you're okay with it, and if you don't mind, is it okay if I talk about that just very
Of
briefly?
course, go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so and it just makes it easy for us to take away something handy from here. It's called the pause framework. Especially like I was saying, we are all walking, talking media these days. So the pause framework, the P stands for don't pause. P stands for literally pause, and don't immediately forward or publicize things that you have received. Um, the second is A, which is ask. Could this cause harm, even if it's unintentional? Could it cause further distress? Is it necessary? Ask those questions to yourself, right? Use respectful language, like we just spoke about. Use respectful language. This is preventable action. So use respectful language. There is a failure of the system as well in this place, because of which something like this might have happened. So use respectful language. Most importantly for me, I think, because of the work that we are doing here as well in Pukar and Samachita, is the S, which is share support. Don't just share the news. Don't just share the curiosity aspect of it. Share the resource information. Share helplines. Share counselors. If you don't have that, I think it would do no harm to not share at all the news. And then lastly, I think this is what we were talking about earlier about amplifying the positive or the hope, which is E, and that is encourage hope. Also discuss that this is preventable, that it is, recovery is possible. When you're talking about suicide, also talk about this, so that it's not always this one-sided, uh, very difficult war that we are fighting against, right? So that's pause for you, something to take away with you, to kind of remind you of how we could use our words and actions of reporting suicide more responsibly. P is for pause, A is for ask questions, U is for use respectful language, S is for share support, and E is for um, encourage hope. Any thoughts on this that anybody has or you have with us? You're on mute if you're saying
Yeah,
something.
no, I'm. It was really good. Thank you, Manu, and I completely
Great.
agree with that framework. Yeah.
Awesome. And I think some of the key points that I also picked up from your session, I want to say those before I open the floor up to questions. So if you have questions, please, begin to think about them. Some of the important things are not to talk about the method. I mean, really, is it really important to talk about the method from as a person? A person has lost his or her life. Let's not speak about the method, the location, use respectful language, and share resource. I think these are the four. If nothing else, I'm taking away. These are the four things that I
Absolutely.
would, be able to put to use on a regular daily basis, not just with suicide, I think, but especially with that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and the floor is open to questions if anyone has any questions. And it would be really nice if there are more people who have videos on than just Vikas and me and Arun for some time. But it would be really nice if some more people switched on their videos. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask right now. Thank you, Arun, for switching on the video. Any questions from you, Arun? Sorry, I'm putting you on a spot here.
No
Yeah.
problem. I think during the session that Sneha had, I think there was sufficient conversation specifically around it and the Papageno effect. Expecting a money-making institution to, act responsibly is something that we have not really had a lot of success with as society. So I wouldn't expect that as much. But a responsible consumer can do a lot more if they act than anything else. So it's
Yeah,
important that we all have our own definitions of this. Ensure that we act responsibly. We ask the questions. We make people hold them responsible. If you don't ask, you don't get. It's a
yeah,
crying baby gets milk. Otherwise, yeah, that's
right.
that, right? So I think I get that from what Vikas says. Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally agree.
Thank you, Arun. And that reminds me of the conversation that Vikas and I were also having, I think, yesterday or day before, where uh, the whole the whole point about us being more responsible about communicating this does not mean that we are taking away the responsibility from media to become more responsible. Absolutely not. And to
Yeah.
add to Arun's point, that may take some time and more consciousness conscious it's not coming to me today. Somehow the words are not wording, but they need a little bit more. Organizations need a little bit more heart before that can happen, and that's still a ways away. Meanwhile, we don't need to wait for that, and that's the point of today's session, right? We ourselves are in some ways, whether we are celebrities or not yet, in some ways influencing, our environment, by the way we speak about these things. And it's important for us to pick that
Yeah.
correct language and the correct words. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hi, Anu. I would like to share. My name is
Hi,
Anuja,
Anuja. Please
and
do.
I thank you, Vikas. This was really really awesome session because usually any session literally feels like, oh, we know this, we've heard of this, and it sounds like the same cycle. But this was the examples and the real life examples who we know. It really makes a lot of difference. So thank you so much for that. And Anu, what the framework that you mentioned, pause. Um, uh, I think it's so relevant because not many people talk about it. And I'm going to use that because I do sessions with the school teachers and students.
Beautiful.
And I think that before we reach the journalism and media, because they are like, salaried people and they do it for a living and they get a kick out of whose news is, it's like TRP kind of a thing. But
Yeah.
students, when they have, I'm thinking that students have, schools have their own magazines, newsletters, and all those things, and
Yeah.
forums and groups. So I want, like, this is my thought that every school should have, and they think going to counselors is really like a stigma. People make fun of them, and if someone sees me going to the counselor, they'll think something is going on. All those things. So how to normalize it? How to sensitize them that it's very important. There's nothing wrong, like no one should be cornered or pointed out for doing that. So the school sessions is what I was focusing on, and this is like perfect timing that gave me so many more ideas to include and simplify the entire thing. But my only thing is, when we talk about suicide prevention or even suicide prevention gatekeeper training or anything, the moment the S word is used, schools are like, no, 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 we don't want any such session. And some of the school heads have told me that, why don't you change the name and modify the thing, because it's very it's a scary thing. Parents don't want their children to attend such things. We all know, Vikas also mentioned all that stuff. So do you think that renaming or changing the sessions just for the entry or making people not too scared to attend is a good practice, or has anyone done it, and how have you done it? I would like to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuja. Thank you for your kind words. It's it's such a tricky question. There's two parts to this. So one is something is better than nothing, right? So to that I'd say, if somebody is not allowing you to do something at all, if you use one word, but they'll allow you to do it if you water it down, then I would say do it, water it down, because then something is better than nothing. But I also am mindful of the fact that it has to lead somewhere. So we have, like, it's not your responsibility, but I'm saying as a society, I think it has to eventually lead to a day where you can have sessions on suicide for children. One of the things you can do is when somebody tells you, oh, you can't use this word or whatever, like parents or whatever, you can show them evidence. I can share the evidence with you. I can share the papers with you that I know of that show conclusively, academic papers that research that have showed that when you talk to kids about suicide does not make them more likely to die by suicide. Now, would that convince them? Probably no. I don't think that would convince them, because those fears go beyond research, and many people are just very skeptical about research in the first place, especially in these times, right? But at least you have something to fall back on if somebody starts challenging you. Why are you doing this? So you have this whole research that says, okay, I'm doing this because there's research that says it does not have an impact. You are allowed to have your opinions, but I'm basing my opinions on my facts, and facts say this is this. And I do think that, and there's many examples, like you can look at trainings that they do in Australia, in the US, where they actually do talk about suicide with other children. Now, obviously, they'll come back to you and say, oh, these are different cultures or whatever. Our kids are not brought up in that environment, whatever. But there's enough evidence for you to fall back on if somebody challenges you. But at the same time, I do think that, yes, if somebody is not ready to have the real conversation yet, you can have the proxy conversation and which hopefully one day, because of the tremendous work all you guys are doing, will lead to the real conversation.
Yeah. Get your foot in the door for
Pretty
sure.
much. Yeah.
True,
Yeah.
that's true. Because it was really shocking for me. The pre-survey questionnaire I did with like about 100 plus teachers at a school, um, gave me a figure which I was not ready for. That 90% teachers do not use the word or are not comfortable using the word suicide. They don't even go anywhere close to it. And unfortunately, that school itself had two incidents. And I had been, kind of prodding them to do this on like an ASAP thing. But unfortunately, they agreed to do it after the second thing happened. And despite that, having more than 4 counselors and 100 plus teachers, they were not talking about this openly in the school, and they were not ready to use the word.
Yeah.
And the teachers are adults, and they are not even comfortable using that word in their family or friends group for discussing such things. So imagine how deep is that stigma, or
Yeah.
whatever we want to call it. It's really disturbing. how do we help children if adults are like this?
I mean, absolutely. And it's you see all these. I mean, these are you're talking about schools. You look at IITs and NITs and how many suicides are happening in these educational institutions, right? And you think about like these are like forget children. These are adults, right? You're talking about adults. These are adults, and there's so many suicides, and they still can't like they have all the counselors and everything, but they are also very very. I've talked to counselors who have told me that the way they are reached out by their by IITs is that they'll reach out to them and they'll call them and then tell them, Ki, can you please make them more tough? Like that's their briefing. Like this is what कि मैम आप हमारे बच्चों को टफ बना दो बहुत बहुत snowflakes है ये. I mean this is from an IIT, right? Powers that be, those are the most intelligent people apparently in India, right? And so this, yes, this runs really deep, and this is not just schools, this is colleges, this is universities, and as I said, I think this requires a much bigger cultural societal level change, which is hopefully forthcoming in some years. I mean, I would like to think that the situation is better than it was 20 years ago. I don't know. You would know much more about this, Anuja and Anu and all you guys. But so you would think that incremental changes would hopefully, we'll be at a position someday that we can talk about this more freely. Because obviously, if you look at national suicide rates in India, which is basically my whole research, as I look at epidemiological trends of suicide in India, they just keep going up. So if this was going to work, if us not talking about was going to work, it would have worked by now. The fact that suicide rates keep going up means it's not working. Whatever we are doing is not working. What you're not talking about suicide is not working. It's not stopping people from dying by suicide. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also finding ourselves at extremes, right? On one end, we are not talking about suicide, but when there is a suicide, all that we're doing is talking about suicide, and in all the wrong words. It's kind of quite an interesting contradiction. But on that note, I know we are above our time now, so I want to thank you again, Vikas, for really, I think especially the examples. I think that really drove the points home about the power of. I see that Zoom user has a question. I don't know your name. Sorry, I just see Zoom user. Maybe we'll just take it right after this if Vikas has a few minutes after we close the session. But in the meanwhile, I think Arun has shared the feedback form and the information about and Samachita Foundation on chat. If you could just take a minute to fill that out, that would be super helpful. But thank you again, Vikas. Nothing, I mean, I think this was incredibly useful. And you call yourself an academician, but you made it so interesting. And that usually those two things don't go together in my head.
No, no, they don't. They're a bunch of most
Yeah.
boring people on the planet. Trust me, I hang out with them all the time.
But that wasn't the feeling I got today, and I hope that was true for everybody else as well. So appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here on a Saturday morning. And Zoom user, if you have a question, and Vikas, if you're okay with staying on,
Yeah, I
just to
have
take
time.
that.
I'm more than happy to take the question. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tanu Sadbani.
Hi, hi.
I'm a volunteer with Lifeline, if you're aware of it.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to know, I had a friend whose son was very talented. She was extremely proud. He was a great singer. He used to write lyrics. And one fine day, he committed suicide.
Mhm.
I want to
Can
know,
I just pause you right there, just because we've had this session and we've just spoken about how we want to change our language. Let's do it right from
okay, I
now and
mean,
we die by suicide. Sorry about that.
yes, okay. I'm just being very open. Okay.
Yes.
And so, the reason I want to know, okay, how do we understand a mindset of a person who is thinking about committing, you know, taking his life or committing
Um,
suicide?
so that's thank you. I think because I told this to Anu before, I don't have a psychology background, so I honestly, to be honest, I can't speak to that. I think somebody with a psychology or a mental health background would be able to speak to this professionally than me. I work with numbers and stats, but from whatever I know, this goes back to what we have been talking about the past 15 minutes is talking about it. If we live in a world where the person who is going through difficult times does not feel like they cannot talk about this is something that can be changed, right? I'm not saying that if we lived in a, so I'll come out and say this, I don't think we can prevent all suicides, but I think we can prevent most suicides. And if we live in a world where the person who is going through something feels free to talk about it with anybody, with their friends, with their parents, with their teachers, whoever it may be, right? that that can lead us to better understanding what you're talking about, what that person was maybe going through before they died by suicide. We don't know, and maybe they wouldn't have told anybody, even if they felt the need, even if they were free to talk about it to anybody. But I think as people around them, the most you can do is facilitate that conversation. It's not, and I don't think other people around them should be blamed for not seeing the signs. I just think that's a worse sort of blaming. I don't think people around people should be blamed. So I think we, as a collective, I think the society needs to move towards a place where everybody feels free to talk about it, irrespective of their age, if they're 16 or 17, you know. And the other thing I would say is that, you mentioned that the person was very talented and wrote lyrics and whatever. I think it's a separate thing. Because I talked about Robin Williams, I talked about Kate Spade, I talked about Anthony Bourdain. Like, these people were at the epitome, like at the apex of their respective professions, right? So as people, we go, why Anthony Bourdain, why Kate Spade? They had the world on their feet, so to speak, right? But I think that whatever talent you have or whatever extraordinary abilities you have, that is separate from mental health issues. And I think that's the other thing. I would like to say that mental health issues can impact anybody. It does not matter whether you are extraordinary in one way or the other, or not. I think mental health issues are very separate from who you are or what you do in your professional space. So as sad as it is that somebody with such talent, died by suicide, I think that's separate. So yeah, for me, I think it's about creating that safe space for people to think that they are allowed to talk about this without being judged.
Yep. Thank you, Vikas. And although
Thank
you
you.
say
Thank
you're
you
not,
so much.
I think
Thank
you've
you.
spoken like one for sure.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. And with that, we will close the session. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Vikas, and thank you, everybody else, for being
Thank you,
here. We'll
people.
see you
Thank
next
you.
month.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.